Thank you very much, Pekka, for the very nice introduction and for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be here in Toronto. And I want to tell you about Mileva Marić Einstein. You've all heard about the man, but very few have heard the story of Mileva. I think maybe this is a bit loud, or I'll try to speak like this. So the role of Mileva Marić Einstein is unfortunately not very well known, and that's what I want to explore with you today. So my plan is to examine how Mileva Marić and Albert Einstein worked together for nearly 20 years. I want to look at this in the historical and social context. And mostly my goal is not to say anything bad about Albert Einstein, but rather to give justice to Mileva, because she's been badly treated by history. So to start, Mileva was born in a rich and well-educated family in Serbia. She was born in 1875. She was the oldest of a family of 3. Her father, Miloš, was a very respected man in his community. He was also very wealthy, and he wanted his daughter to study. He spoke fluent German, but not his wife. And she had 2 younger siblings, her sister, Dorka, and Miloš, her brother. And Albert came from a family, his father, he was born in Germany, in a Jewish family. His father, Hermann Einstein, was an industrial, and he had a company doing electric motors. His mother was from a very rich, family, and she was quite a nasty character, as we will see. Pauline la Pauline, Pauline the nasty one, she's, as I was called as a kid. So anyway, Pauline Einstein, Pauline Koch, was rather nasty. And he had only one sister, Maya. Albert was 3 years younger than Mileva. And Mileva did her studies in Serbia, and she attended high school the last year where girls were allowed in that school. In 1992, her father got a special authorization from the Minister of Education, such that she could attend classes, physics classes with the boys. And in 1894, she went to Switzerland to complete her high school degree in Zurich. And you have to understand that in Switzerland, they were more welcoming to women in universities at that time. Her temperament, she's said by her schoolmates to have been extremely brilliant, but very reserved. She was not a talkative person, and she was not looking after fame or honor. She was perseverant and very determined. The type of person who got to the bottom of things. She kept going towards her goal. She was someone who knew where she was heading, and she would go for it. Whereas Albert was quite different. He was rather the go lucky, no, how do you say? Go get lucky, no? What is it? No? Happy-go-lucky, there we go. Happy-go-lucky type, very inquisitive mind, bohemian and rebel, as we have all heard. He was not a very disciplined person, and he's known also to change his mind with the wind. He hated the discipline in German schools. He was born in Ulm, in the southern Germany, and he also ended up going to Switzerland to finish his high school because he didn't like the discipline in Germany. So they both met at the Polytechnic Institute in Zurich in 1896, and which became what is known today as the ETH. Both were admitted to the physics-mathematics section. Mileva was the oldest of the class, whereas Albert was the youngest. And there were 5 students. She was the only woman. So she left 1 year later, just for 1 semester, to go to Heidelberg. They were getting too close, and she wanted to take some distance, but she came back afterwards. From the beginning, they shared a passion for physics, music, and for each other. They just hit it off together. They spent countless hours studying together. Mileva was methodical and organized, and she would help him channel his energy. She also guided his studies and would pick which books he should read and things like that. Mileva's friends, she was in a boarding house for young women, and three other young Serbian women were there with her. Milena Bota and Rudzika Dracic were also there, and her best friend, Helen Koffler, who is not on the picture, here's Mileva. And all these women spoke on how they were always together, working and discussing, reading books, and commenting on those. And Albert would also come freely to borrow books in Mileva's room in her absence. So Mileva maintained a lifelong relationship with her friend Helen, and they exchanged letters over 30 years or so. And the grandson of Helen Savic, Milan Popovic, has published those letters. But he says that the Germans came and they invaded his grandmother's house, and some of the letters were destroyed. But it's always the key ones that are destroyed. So it's for some family secrets are being preserved. And Serbians were really good on that code of honor. And so there are there is missing information in the book. And the Germans did well in destroying some of the letters randomly. So the beginning of their collaboration, from the start, they were really, really close and always spending their time together. We know more on how they were acting together from 43 letters that are preserved to this day, 43 letters that Albert sent to Mileva. And 10 letters written by Mileva to Albert are also preserved. They're less because either they were destroyed later on, or Albert didn't keep them, or something like that. So there are lots of unknown in this story. One of the most recent biography of Mileva Marić Einstein is written by a history professor at City College of New York, and she did an excellent job. It's a huge book. I highly recommend it to you. And the letters themselves, the letters themselves were published in 1992 by Venn and Schulman, and they appeared in that book. And as Radmila Milentijevic notes, the letters from Albert are peppered with terms such as our new studies, our research, our viewpoint, our theory, our article, or the best, our work on relative motion. So you see, it's from those letters that we get a first-hand account of what happened. And I've done every effort to avoid speculation and just stick to the facts, because there is a lot of speculation on this topic. So the first letter, those letters they were together in school, and it's not because they didn't have internet that they were sending letters like that. It's because in all the school holidays, they would go back to their respective families, in Serbia for Mileva, and in Italy because the Einstein family had moved there. So the first letter, Albert writes, when I read Helmholtz for the first time, it seems so odd that you were not at my side. And today, this is not getting better. I find the work we do together very good, healing, and also easier. So from this letter, we see that they're always together. Mileva helps Albert to better focus, as he explains here. He writes, the climate here does not suit me at all. He was in Italy. And while I miss work, I find myself filled with dark thoughts. In other words, I miss having you nearby to kindly keep me in check and prevent me from meandering. Here are the academic results that the two of them got in their written... What's so funny? The one, this here? Yeah. But this is well known. This is well known that Albert Einstein was an excellent theorist, but he was not good at applied physics. Apparently, one day he got a shock, a big electric shock in working with an apparatus, and that sort of, made him a bit not wanting to work in applied physics. Anyway, so the point here is really to see that the results are quite similar. The only difference is in applied physics, and you'll see it's important later on. But then they had to take an oral exam. And in the oral exam, the student is alone with the committee or one professor. And the one professor was Minkowski, from the Minkowski space. And he gave 11 out of 12 to everyone, the four men in the class, except Mileva, who got 5 points. But no, they were equal on their written exams. But she got a poor grade there, and therefore, even though Albert Einstein is average for all the years were 4.6 and Mileva 4.7, Albert got his degree, but Mileva didn't get it because she failed the oral exam. But there is no proof of was she really lousy or something. It's only Minkowski who was there. So after that, all the three men in the class, except there were four young men in the class, the three other students got an academic position, but Albert Einstein didn't get one. And he suspects that one of his professors was blocking him. He wrote letters everywhere in Europe to try to get an academic position like the other students in his class, but he couldn't get one. And he was really suspecting that Weber was giving him a bad name. And without a job, he refused to marry Mileva. So they gave private lessons to make ends meet, and as Mileva writes to her friend Helen, they continue to live and work as before. So she failed the exam, he didn't have a job, so they kept just studying and reading and discussing as they had always done. Albert confirms this collaboration in one of his letters. He says, "I look forward to resume our new common work. You must now continue with your research. How proud I will be to have a doctor for my spouse when I'll only be an ordinary man." And they came back to Zurich in October to complete their thesis, at least Albert, and to resume their common studies. But that's the time where Pauline Einstein, Albert's mother, started to mingle in their things. So she finds Mileva too old because she is 2.5 years older than him. She says, by the time you're 30, she'll already be an old hag. What am I? I don't know. So, and Albert is smart. He repeats that to Mileva in a letter in 1900. And she also said she cannot enter a respectable family. And then she says, Mileva, it's also that Mileva was not Jewish nor German, and she had a limp, and she was too intellectual in Pauline Einstein's mind. There were also lots of prejudice against Slavic people at the time. I think it's still there today. And Albert's father, on his side, was also requesting that his son would find work before getting married. And I think at the time, the father had to sign for the son to be able to marry. I believe so. I need to check on that fact. But they keep working together, and they published their first article in December 1900. And both of them refer to this first article at that time in separate letters to friends. Albert writes, "We will send a private copy to Boltzmann to see what he thinks, and I hope he will answer us." Like we always do, we always ask our colleagues for their opinion and all that. And Mileva writes to Helen, she says, no, that was Mileva writing that. And Albert wrote to one of his friends, Michele Besso. He says that his friend visited, no, he wrote to, a letter to Mileva. So he wrote to her that his friend visited his uncle, Professor Jung, on my behalf, one of the most influential physicists in Italy, and gave him a copy of our article. So it's clear. Why was this article only signed of the name of Albert Einstein? And maybe the reason was that for Mileva, they were one unique entity. They were the same. They were so close, and she entirely trusted him and all that, as she will say later on. And so one can believe that, or also because she probably wanted to promote his career. He didn't have a job, would not marry her until he had one, and she didn't have a degree, so she was kind of stuck. So for him to make a name for himself, given that Professor Weber was blocking him, it was quite important. But another biographer of Mileva, Dort Kirstig, he thinks that since so few women publish articles in the Annalen der Physik, the journal from Germany, that this could have cast a shadow on his credibility. That's also possible, that an article signed by a woman would have less worth. And so we don't know, but it's most likely this was a joint decision. Proof of the collaboration from Albert's own hand. In March 1901, Albert returns to Milan and he writes, "How happy and proud I will be when the two of us together will have brought our work on relative motion to a victorious conclusion." So it's clear that on special relativity, they were working together. Then that's where Mileva's destiny changed. Albert was in Italy with his family since a few months, and he was pestering her to get together to have a nice weekend, lovers' weekend together. But she just wanted to keep studying to retake the oral exam. She had 2 chances at it. But he pursued her to meet him in Como, at Lake Como, a very romantic place. And sure enough, she got pregnant. But Albert still didn't have a job, and he persisted in not marrying her. But he promised to do so as soon as he would get a job. He says, "The moment I get a job, I will marry you, and I will take you with me without saying anything to anyone until all is settled." But he didn't quite stick to his word. So, pregnant, hopefully a little less, pregnant with a large dress, she went and retook her second chance for the oral exam. This time, it's Professor Weber who was the examiner, and he gave her a low grade. So Weber was the one who was blocking Albert's career. He knew they were together. And again, she failed. So she wrote to her friend, Helen, "I abandoned my studies despite the fact that, thanks to Weber, I did not receive my doctorate degree. Because of him, I have suffered a lot, and I do not wish to ever return to him." But now she's pregnant, so she doesn't have a student visa to stay in Switzerland. So she came back to Serbia in the fall of 1901. She was 6 months pregnant when she came back to Zurich to try to convince Albert to marry her. But he refused again. I think she made 2 trips to try to change his mind. She gave birth to a little girl, Liesel, she was called, in January 1902. No one knows what happened to her. Someone wrote a book this thick about that, about Einstein's daughter, but there's absolutely no information. She found nothing. She found nothing. She just went everywhere in Serbia and tried to bribe all sorts of people to speak, people who had known the family and all that, but nobody would say a word. Those family secrets are well kept in Serbia. So if you have something to hide, you should go there. So Mileva alone came back a few months later to join Albert in Bern in June of 1902, because by then he had gotten a job. In fact, it's the father of his good friend, Marcel Grossman, who was also a schoolmate at the university. This father found a job at the patent office in Bern. So he first heard of that in December, so a few weeks before the baby was born. And then he wrote to Mileva, "When you will be my little wife, we shall resume diligently our scientific work, such as not to become Philistines." Philistines is uneducated, ignorant people. So in June, Albert starts his job at the patent office. Mileva made 2 brief visits on temporary visas. And finally, Albert's father, Herman, died in October 1902, but he granted his permission for a marriage from his deathbed. So Liesel was probably given up for adoption by Mileva's father around that time. So they got married in 1903, about a year after the illegitimate child was born. And they lived in Bern in a small apartment, which is now a museum that I have visited, and it's tiny, tiny. And Albert was working 8 hours a day, 6 days a week at the patent office. Mileva was taking care of domestic tasks, and they worked together in the evening and late in the night, discussing, calculating, writing together. Albert mentions this in a letter to a friend, and Mileva also writes the same to her friend in March 1903. And she says to Helen how sorry she is that Albert works so hard. He's 8 hours at the office, and then late in the night, they keep their calculations and all that. Those were two passionate people about physics. We know a few here in the room, too. So it was very important to them to continue their own work. A year later, a year after they got married, their first son, Hans Albert, is born. And then, 1905, came the miracle year where the prodigious productivity of Albert, someone who came out of the patent office, is well known. So you see, he had full training as a physicist before now. So the publications in 1905, he signed 5 articles in the Annalen für Physik, one on the photoelectric effect, and that's what would earn him the Nobel Prize in 1921. He wrote 2 papers on the Brownian motion, the paper on special relativity, as well as one specifically on the equivalence between mass and energy, E equals mc squared. In those days, people were paid to comment on articles. So in his spare time, he also found time to comment on 21 scientific papers, because they were always craving for a little bit more money. They were quite poor at the time, and so they needed more money. So that was one way to make a little extra. And he also, during that time, he submitted his doctoral thesis on the dimensions of molecules and received his degree in July. So you see, it's a lot for one young man. So, birth of the special relativity, he told one of his biographers, Schenkland, that Albert Einstein told this man that his work on relativity had been with him for more than 7 years, and the photoelectric effect, 5 years. So this goes back to the times where Mileva and him were constantly working together and discussing. Another biographer of Einstein, Peter Michaelmore, also writes in his book that after having spent 5 weeks to complete the article containing the basis of special relativity, Albert spent 2 weeks in bed while Mileva read the article over and over before posting it. So they were exhausted. So for the first time, they decide, after having done all this work, which was, in fact, the conclusion of all these years spent discussing and all that, they decide to take their first vacation in Serbia. At the time, Mileva's family lived in Novi Sad. So they visited so here is Novi Sad at those days and today, so it's a big, large city. So they visited 3 times in Serbia, 1905, 1907, and 1913. And they met lots of friends, family, relatives, and all that. So we have lots of testimonies from those people who have spoken directly with Mileva or Albert or have interacted with them. For example, Dort Kirchtig, the second current biographer, here is Kirchtig, spent 35 years of his life roaming Serbia and trying to find all the people who had met them and talking to them and asking them questions. He also met with Hans Albert in 1973, and Hans Albert told him, recalling having seen his parents working next to each other in the evenings at the dining room table. Mileva's brother, Milos, was a medical student, and he spent time in Zurich and in Paris. And he visited the family several times and stayed for long periods with them, so he had a chance to see close up exactly how Mileva and Albert lived and worked and interacted together. And Milos is described as being someone of great integrity, so Dort Kirchtig establishes that clearly. And Milos says that so Kirchtig writes in his book that Milos described how during the evenings and at night when silence fell upon the town, the young married couple would sit together at the table, and at the light of a kerosene lantern, they would work together on physics problems. Miller Jr. spoke of how they calculated, wrote, read, and debated. So they were really using each other as sounding boards and comparing ideas and looking for flaws in each other's ideas and all that. So Kirchtig said that he got this information directly from two close relatives of Mileva Marić, her godmother, whom he met in 1955, and a cousin whom he met in 1961. There are other testimonies. For example, Mileva is said to have told her father in 1905, before our departure, we finished an important scientific work which will make my husband known around the world. And she said that in 1905, and Dort Kirchtig heard this in 1961 from the cousin, Sofia Galish, who lived with the family. She was living with the Marić family. And she was present when Mileva said that to her father. So it's first-hand account. And then two other people, the godmother and a young cousin from Mileva's father, Žarko Marić, they reported separately the same sentence. They had both heard it from Mileva's father. So Mileva's father had repeated that to them. So second hand. Žarko Marić, whom I just mentioned, the young cousin, was about the same age as Albert and Mileva. And at the time, he and his wife, Leposava, had one daughter, we see here, Georginka. And so when the Einstein family came for a visit, they were all sharing the same house in the Villa Kula in Kac, which is a city nearby Novi Sad, but in the countryside. And so Mileva was taking care of the kids while his wife was cooking for the whole gang. And he describes how Mileva calculated, wrote, and worked with Albert. And they would sit here in the garden, in the shade, and discuss physics all the time. But he also mentioned how it was harmonious and it was based on mutual respect, that these two were really equal to each other and respected each other's opinion. There's also, because the Einstein family always had problems making ends meet, they would often take boarders, Serbian students coming to study in Zurich. And for example, one of them was the son of a mathematics professor, and he came to board with the Einstein family. His daughter recalls having heard her father tell the story on how Einstein sometimes assisted his wife with domestic tasks, feeling sorry for her when he saw her often staying up past midnight to solve his mathematical problems from his notes. So many people have seen them interact together, discuss physics, and work together. So from 1905 to 1909, they continued to collaborate and to write several articles on relativity, the mass-energy equivalence, gas theory, and Brownian motion. The few preserved letters refer to this. So Albert always mentioned the details of his research in his letters. And of course, if you're scientists here, how many of you discuss the details with your spouse unless the spouse, the details of your research, unless your spouse is also a scientist? So it's also around that time in 1908 that a patent was taken for an ultra-sensitive voltmeter that was made by Konrad Habich and Mileva and Albert. But everybody knows that Albert was not good at practical work. So the first biographer of Mileva wrote that when they were both satisfied, both being Konrad Habich and Mileva, they let Albert the task of describing the apparatus since he was a patent expert. And it makes sense. It makes sense. But Habich asked Mileva, why didn't you put your name there? And that's where she replied, in German. So I'm going to show off my German here. So she says, warum? Wir beide sind nur Einstein. So She says, why? The two of us are just one stone, Einstein, a play on word. We are just one unique entity. So she felt that they were just one. Bon. It took a while, 3 years after the publication of all those incredible papers, before he finally got offered a lecturer position at Bern University, although it was unpaid work, which he did after his own job at the patent office. But soon afterwards, a post opened for him at Zurich University, and he moved to Zurich in October 1909, and then in Prague, because he was trying to get his salary to go up, so he played an old game, and it's not new, and then back to Zurich in 1912. And just before they went to Prague, their second son, Edward, was born. And it was the first successes for Einstein, but also the first worries from Mileva. And she writes to Helen Savage, he is now regarded as the best of the German-speaking physicists, and they give him a lot of honors. I'm very happy for his success because he fully deserves it. I only hope and wish that fame does not have a harmful effect on his humanity. So she was a very clear-thinking woman. And later on she wrote, with all this fame, he has little time for his wife. What is there to say? With notoriety, one gets the pearl, the other the shell. I let you guess who got the shell. So Mileva helps Albert with his lectures. So when he went to Zurich, you know how young professors here, all or those who are not so young now, all remember how hard it is to write your first classes. So Mileva was helping him, and there are several pages, handwritten notes that are clearly first draft, because you see it's full with corrections and all that. And those are written in Mileva's hand. So she was writing his lecture notes for him, or partly, and those are preserved in the Hebraic University in Jerusalem. So they were still collaborating while they were in Zurich. For example, Max Planck once asked for Albert's opinion, and the draft of their reply to Max Planck was written by Mileva in 1910. And again, it's in her handwriting. This is also kept at the Hebraic University archives. During this period, they published 3 more articles. But that's the time where their relationship starts to crumble. Up to 1911, Albert and Mileva still exchanged affectionate postcards. But then it changed because his family, Albert's family, moved back to Berlin. And while he was visiting his family, he also renewed his friendship with his cousin, Elsa Löwenthal, and he started an affair with her. Albert was now famous, and his family feels that Mileva does not suit him. So Pauline comes back in full-fledged to mingle in their affairs. And Mileva mentions that in several letters to her family and to her friends. She was quite miserable with it. Because Pauline was quite, she was vicious. She said horrible things. So Albert maintains a secret correspondence with his cousin, Elsa, over 2 years. They exchanged 21 letters, and of course he told her, destroy everything as soon as you have read them, but she kept them. And so they are now part of the archives as well. So in 1913 and 1914, Albert obtains a position in Berlin. He really tried hard to get a position in Berlin so that he could go and be with Elsa. So he writes to her right away, hey, I got it. I'll be with you shortly. But they still took a vacation, the last visit in Serbia in 1913, and Albert had a brief affair with the Jewish baker's wife. Apparently this woman was a stunning beauty, but the young man is lucky to have come out alive because everybody tried to hide that from Mileva's father, who would just have killed his son-in-law if he had found out. So apparently it was a quite fancy footwork to hide that. And then the marriage goes really bad, and Mileva didn't want to divorce. She's still in love with the man. But Albert writes a very harsh letter where he states his conditions. Okay, you want to stay with me? Fine. But you have to take care of cleaning everything and giving me my food. You must also make sure that my bedroom and study room are perfectly tidy and that the writing table is available only for me. He says, you renounce all personal relations with me. I'm not going to sit next to you at home. You will not walk or travel with me. You're strictly obliged in your relations with me to take into account the following items. You dare not reproach me that I do not show you tenderness, but I also do not expect any from you at all. You stop any conversation with me if I demand so. And you must at once leave my room or my working space upon request. So what kind of a relationship is that? And you must not say bad things about me in front of the kids. But what is important? So, okay, a relation going sour, we have all experienced that, unfortunately. But here are two very unusual clauses. He says, the writing table is available only for me. He doesn't want to work with her anymore. And he says, you renounce from me sitting beside you at home, because that's how they were always discussing and sitting together and discussing. So those two prove that they were still working closely together. So Mileva left Berlin, plus her step-family was there and was miserable for her. She left with her two sons, Edward and Hans Albert. And Edward was always in poor health. He had to go to sanatorium for lung problems. And she dedicates all her energy to her sons. She manages from the alimony that Einstein sometimes sent. Hans Albert had to write several times to his father to beg him to send the money because they had nothing to eat. And she also gave private lessons, piano lessons, and physics and math lessons. As I said, Edward was often sick, and he had costly stays in sanatorium. Mileva also had serious health problems in 1916, so all her life she will struggle financially. In 1919, she finally agreed to a divorce, and one of the divorce clauses states that if Albert receives the Nobel Prize, she will get the prize money, all the prize money. So Albert would get the fame, she would at least get the money. And she wrote to her friend Helen Savage, even my close friends still feel a great deal of admiration for his scientific achievements and transferred that to the personal sphere. You alone understand me best when you were able to say, I no longer care for him. With the money from the Nobel Prize, she bought 2 small apartment buildings and lived off the rent money. But because of the medical bills, she finally had to sell one of those, and she also had there were some problems with that building. So she was always buried under debts due to the cost of the medical expenses for Edward. We see her sitting here at the balcony of her apartment, and she has her cactus collection at the back. And Einstein once wrote to her, I'm nice to you, I send you some nice cactus for your collection. So Edward also in his 20s suffered from schizophrenia and had to be eventually permanently hospitalized. And from the time he was permanently hospitalized, Einstein never visited him. So we see her here with Edward and here with Edward, which one is it? And the wife of Hans Albert, so the 4 of them. I cannot quite tell. So at one point, Albert wrote a will, and he said that the Nobel Prize money that he had already given his inheritance to his sons because they had received the Nobel Prize money. And then Mileva got mad. She said, whoa, minute. That's not that at all. This money is mine. That's not the inheritance for your sons. You must give them something of their own. And after that, she probably threatened him to speak about what had happened, how they had worked together. We don't have this letter, but he replied to her, "You made me laugh when you started threatening me with your recollections. Have you ever considered, even just for a second, that nobody would ever pay attention to you, to your says, if the man you talked about had not accomplished something important? When someone is completely insignificant, there is nothing else to say to this person but to remain modest and silent. This is what I advise you to do." So it was so harsh. She never tried to speak out again. But her friend Milena Bota, who goes back from the time when they were boarding together, she spoke to a newspaper in 1929, a Serbian newspaper. She gave an interview and she said, "If you want to know about the genesis of the special relativity theory, you should talk to Mileva because she personally was involved in its creation. 5 or 6 years ago, Mika, that's the nickname, whoops, this died. Mika spoke to me about that with grief. Perhaps it was difficult for her to evoke the memories of her most pleasant hours, or maybe she didn't want to reduce the great glory of her ex-husband. But when she did that, Mileva was quite uncomfortable about this, and she said, such publication in newspapers do not suit my nature at all, because she was so reserved and private. But I believe that Milena did that just to help me get a bit of Einstein's fame. And so, essentially, that's what she said. This still works, okay. So, Mileva also confided to several people. She wrote a long letter to her godparents, and they told Dort Kirchtig, the biographer, about that. And in this letter, she explained how she had always collaborated with Albert and how he had ruined her life. But she also told her godparents to destroy the letter after having read it. So this letter does not exist. She also spoke with one of her students, Maya Shukan, told one of Einstein's biographers that she had always collaborated with Einstein. She spoke abundantly of her scientific collaboration with her son, Hans Albert, and Hans Albert told that to Dort Kirchtig. She also spoke with her mother and her sister. Albert had a bad conscience, and he wrote to his lawyer, his divorce lawyer, who was a friend in Zurich. He wrote in 1947, thank you, "When Mileva will no longer be there, I'll be able to die in peace." But he got world famous in 1915. He wrote the General Relativity with Marcel Grossman. We don't know if he had started this work with Mileva. We have no way to know who has done what. But as soon as there was this eclipse in 1919, he got instant fame and became very popular. But that was also the beginning of what I call the Einstein's myth. Two people came with Albert Einstein Ellen Dukas was his personal secretary, Albert Einstein's secretary. And she came with him to the US when he moved there in 1933. And one of his close friends also came, an economist. Both of them were executors after Einstein's death. So they were his estate executor. And they did everything they could to hide the existence of Mileva's existence out of loyalty for their friend. They legally, that's criminal, they legally prevented Hans Albert and his wife Frida from publishing the letters he had from his parents. He found a box, Frida found a box, a cardboard box, with all those letters in Mileva's apartment. And they blocked the publication of those letters until their death. She died in 82, he died in 87. Albert Einstein died in 55. So, they blocked the publication of their correspondence, all those letters from which I have quoted earlier. But they appeared in the collected papers of Albert Einstein afterwards. Otto Nathan even had was bold enough to go to visit Mileva's apartment in Zurich to help in the cleanup. There's another myth. Everybody says, look at the man, you know. Look at the man, you know. Of course he's a genius and all that. Look at the hair. But here he is with his sister, Maya. It's not genius, it's a genetic problem. They have a problem with the hair in the family. So this brings me to my conclusion. So the proofs of their collaboration. So as I said, I'm staying away from all speculation, from any speculation. And the clearest evidence comes from Albert's hand, and especially when he says, our work on relative motion. Nothing can be clearer than that. Then one must look at how they interacted and lived together. There are numerous testimonies, I've listed them here, and handwritten documents from Mileva's hands showing that she was actively involved till the end. There are more indirect proof, like that the fact that he gave her the Nobel Prize money, or the decline in Albert's Einstein productivity and creativity after they split, and Albert was always saying, God doesn't play dice with the universe, because he was opposed to quantum mechanics. So he, who was at the forefront of physics in 1905, became, in the tail. He was pestering Bohr, Niels Bohr, all the time with objections about quantum mechanics. Bohr was really annoyed with Einstein. He would always come with arguments against that. And then at the next time they would meet or exchange letters, Einstein would come back with more arguments and pester him. And someone who was working at the Annalen für Physics says that he had seen that the first article was signed with the name Einstein Marital. Marital was the name that she used, that Mileva Marić used with the authorities. It's the Hungarian spelling of her name, because it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. And that's the name that she has on her wedding certificate, for example. But that's just speculation, so I don't include that. But that's a fact that is quite known. That's why I mentioned it. So in my opinion, their union was based on love and respect. Together they produced uncommon work. Their individual contributions will probably never be known. Just like when we work together with our collaborator. You bring an idea, you discuss it, and then, someone says, yes, but have you thought of this? Yeah, and then you add a little bit, and someone else adds something to it, and at the end, when you ask, who did it? No, we did it. We did it. And it's not always clear how the thought process went. So I think the personal contributions, individual contributions will never be known. She was the first person to believe in his talent. Without her, he would never have succeeded. She abandoned her own aspirations, happy to work with him and to contribute to his success. For her, they were one unique entity, Einstein, as she put it. And once started, how do you imagine that? Einstein is famous now, and he gets all these offers and all that. And then, did I tell you, by the way, that my wife and I worked on all this? How do you want to backtrack? Once you started that, it's not only that he was not a nice person, but he cannot do it. It's very difficult to say, oh, by the way, now that I'm famous and all that, I should introduce you to my wife. It becomes impossible. It's a setup that they both put in place such that he would get a job. That's my opinion, that he would get a job, and then they could marry and be happy together. But it cost her everything. So why did she remain silent? I think mostly it's because she was reserved. She was not after honor or fame, and she spoke little about herself. Many of her close friends would say, we don't even know what kind of a person she is. She was very, very reserved. Maybe also as a woman, she felt that she did not deserve all these honors, and she always loved him. So that played against her greatly. So all that is left today is 2 small memorials. One in Zurich, where it says in German, "With pride and love, the people of Serbia." And in Novi Sad, there is also a statue for her. So that is not much. Here are the main references that I mentioned, the various books. So I leave that there for you to see. But I also brought my own book, and there is a small chapter at the end on that. This book is more generally about particle physics for our audience. If you want to explain to your family what we do, that's a good book. And those are the main references that I have used, and I highly recommend this one. The other one here is really good, but it's out of print. But some libraries have it, so you can. CERN had a copy, for example, and like that. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.